Readers, I've noticed something interesting about the books that you've been reading. As you're reading and thinking and talking about these books, it's as if you are reading a novel. But other times, you might be focused more on the information that you're learning. It might sound like you're in history or science class. My guess is you tend to do one more naturally than the other. You might naturally focus more on the story or narrative part of your literary nonfiction book, the characters, the themes, and the plot of the book. Or you might naturally focus more on the information you're learning. Here's the thing: literary nonfiction is full of stories and full of information. This is one of the major complexities of literary nonfiction. The text won't be pure story or pure information, but a mix of both. If you're the kind of reader who tends to follow stories more closely, you'll need to be extra alert to the informational parts. And if you're the kind of reader who tends to follow information more closely, you have to be extra alert to the narrative parts. Today, I want to teach you that literary nonfiction readers use narrative and informational reading strategies flexibly. They notice narrative and informational structures, as well as parts that are a mix of both, and they draw on the appropriate thinking tools to get the most out of all these parts. What this means is that as you read a literary nonfiction book, you have to be alert, noticing when the text reads more like a story and when the text reads more like an informational article. Attending to how the text is structured matters because the structure will often give you clues as to how you might read and fully learn from that part. Let's give this a try with a new chapter of Hidden Figures. Will you notice whether you need to activate your story schema or your information schema to help you understand each part? The colored computers. On her first day of work at Langley, Dorothy Vaughan spent the morning in the personnel department filling out paperwork. As part of her orientation, she held up her right hand and swore the United States Civil Service oath of office. I, Dorothy Vaughan, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She took the pledge seriously, but it was her identification badge that made her feel like an official employee. The badge, a blue metal circle featuring an image of her face with the winged NACA logo on either side, granted her access to the various facilities at the Langley Laboratory. Readers, stop for a minute and think, does this part call on you to use your story schema or your information schema? It sounds like a story, right? You can really picture the scene, what Dorothy was doing, saying, and thinking. Here's the thing, readers. Identifying whether a part is more informational or more narrative is going to be pretty easy for you. What's trickier is making sure that because you're alert to this being a story or narrative part, you push yourself to infer about characters' traits and problems and the issues they face. All the smart work you do when reading narratives. So, right now, pick something from this bookmark that you can try. What narrative thinking work will help you get more out of the part we just read? And then add to your thinking by using an example. And then I'll reread the part to make sure that we're doing this work well. The colored computers. On her first day of work at Langley, Dorothy Vaughan spent the morning in the personnel department filling out paperwork. As part of her orientation, she held up her right hand and swore the United States Civil Service oath of office. I, Dorothy Vaughan, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She took the pledge seriously, but it was her identification badge that made her feel like an official employee. The badge, a blue metal circle featuring an image of her face with the winged NACA logo on either side, granted her access to the various facilities at the Langley Laboratory. Take a few minutes to pause and jot your thinking. And make sure to write the title of this book, Hidden Figures, at the top of your notebook page. Can you feel how, with just a little more attention to Dorothy as a character, thinking about how she is interacting with this particular setting and what it means to her, you've gotten a lot more out of these two paragraphs? Because the author's point here isn't to teach about what kind of badges the NACA gave out. The point is to show how Dorothy felt about this new position. As we read on, notice that the text continues to read like a story, and you need to do smart thinking work about the characters, conflicts, and setting. Or, if you have to change your schema to think harder about ideas and information, the way you would when it's an informational text. Since its establishment in 1917, the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory's operations had been concentrated on the campus of Langley Field, an Army Air Corps base located on the eastern bank of Hampton's Back River. The service building, where Dorothy went through orientation, was one of the oldest buildings on the field. Year after year, the number of buildings had grown until the laboratory decided to expand to the area on the western side of the river. That land was still a forest when the construction began, and employees joked about having to work in such a remote place. The weekly Langley employee newsletter, Air Scoop, described it as a land of desolation, a land of marshes and mosquitoes. Readers, does this part still read like a story, or are you noticing a shift here? It feels like the text is teaching information, almost giving facts about exactly what the Langley Laboratory looked like. Let me remind you of a few key things readers of informational text think about. Readers of informational text think about how parts fit together. They think about key vocabulary and multiple central ideas. They think about supporting details. Readers, I'm going to give you a tip here. Sometimes the text isn't just story or just informational. As I read on, think with me. Does this next part feel more informational, more narrative, or does it do some of both? Be on the lookout for places where narrative thinking will help you, but also be on the lookout for parts that seem more informational. Use the charts to make the most of both kinds of work. After Dorothy finished the morning's paperwork, she boarded a campus shuttle that drove her to the end of a forested back road connecting the east side of the Langley campus to the west side. She looked around at the strange landscape of two-story brick offices and construction sites with half-finished buildings. Towering behind one of the buildings was a gigantic 3-story high ribbed metal pipe. It was part of a wind tunnel called the 16-foot high speed tunnel, which was used for experiments on airplanes. To make the scene even more unusual, all of the buildings had been painted dark green to camouflage them against possible attacks from America's wartime enemies. The shuttle bus stopped to let Dorothy off at the front door of an office building called the Warehouse Building. She went inside and found rooms filled with desks arranged classroom style. There were office bright ceiling lights and narrow windows that looked out over the construction going on outside. From inside the rooms, Dorothy heard a new, unfamiliar sound, a steady beat of mechanical calculating machines, so big they each took up an entire desktop. It was like listening to a parade of drums, each time a click when a number was entered, a drum beat when the operations key was hit, and a full drum roll when the machine ran through a complex calculation. The same scene and the same sounds played in all the rooms where the women were working. Women were performing the same work at a similar place on the east side. The only difference between the east computers and the west computers was obvious. All of the women sitting at the desks in Dorothy's workspace were black. Readers, take a minute and think, maybe jot some notes before you move on to the next video. What were you able to notice about narrative work, characters and settings, conflicts? And then what did you notice about informational parts, the details or ideas that seem important?